Hey guys, in this video we're going to talk about fractions on a number line. You can see down below here I have a number line drawn. The number line goes from 0 to 1, but as you know, number lines would go on indefinitely. But there's a missing fraction right in the middle of the number line, and that's what we're going to talk about in the video. How do you figure that out? Now this one's pretty easy, but we're going to get a bit more complicated. So let's get into the video. We're going to start with a simple number line, and you're going to see quite a few of these in your workbook today. And on this number line, I'm going to plot two numbers, 0 on my left, we'll put 1 on my right. So we're talking about one whole jump here, and we talked about that word last week, a whole. When we're dealing with fractions, knowing the whole is important, and knowing how many intervals are in there, this word interval, and we'll talk about that a little bit today. An interval is how many spots or jumps in between 0 and 1 I'm going to find on my number line. So this first one I'm going to start out like this. Now, don't pay attention necessarily to the amount of lines, because you could make a mistake if you're counting the lines. And instead of the lines, let's talk about the intervals. So from 0 to my first line, that's my first interval. From my first line to my second line, that's my second interval. And from my second line here to my third line, that would be my third interval. So in this case, we're talking about thirds, right? I have 3 equal pieces. They're equal shares. That means we're talking about thirds. Well, over here where one whole is, we should know by now and recognize this, that one whole would be the same as writing the fraction 3/3, right? 3 out of 3 is the same as having one whole. Well, if that line is 3/3, then the one before it right here, this one must be 2/3, because that's my second out of my third interval. And then obviously the one before it must be my 1/3 line. So you can see here how fractions on a number line are going to grow. We're going to start at 0 and jump to 1/3, my first interval, then jump to 2/3, my second interval, and then we're going to jump to 3/3 or 1 whole, my final interval. Now that one had thirds. It's pretty simple. You might see some that are broken up into smaller intervals today, like fifths or eighths or maybe even twelfths. But I'm going to show you some tips in the video for how to figure this out. So let's look at a new number line. This one, same way, I'm going to start a number line here. Great strategy to figure this out. Sketch your own. And we'll start with 0 over here on the left. We're going to start with 1 on the right. So again, my whole, we're talking about from 0 to 1 on a number line. But let's put some intervals in there. This time I'm going to start by first cutting my line in half. 2 equal pieces, they're equal shares. We know that that would be the halfway point of the line. But now I'm going to add 2 more points. And in this case, again, counting those intervals would definitely help. So you start over here at 0. I'm going to jump, count the intervals. That's 1, 2, 3. This time I have 4 intervals. And if I have 4 equal intervals, and I know this one over here on the right looks a bit smaller, but you know they're equal shares, it's hand drawn. If that is my 4th one, then that would be 4 out of 4. And we know that 4 out of 4 is the same as 1 whole. Well, if that one's 4 out of 4, then if we jump back to the one before it, that would be 3/4, or 3 out of 4. The one before that would be 2/4, and the one before that would be 1/4, or 1/4. Now, some of you may be looking at this middle fraction and saying, hey, that's equal to 1/2. Well, it should be, because that is, and we said this at the start, that's halfway on my number line. And we said earlier that 2/4 is definitely, and we agree about this, is equal to 1/2. How do I know that? Because in 1/2, 1 is half of 2, and in 2/4, 2 is half of 4. So we said any fraction where the numerator, top number, is half of the denominator, we know that fraction is going to be equal to 1/2. Okay, let's look at one more. Here's a new number line. And you might see something like this. I'm going to again start with 0. Except this time I'm going to jump to 2. So be careful here that my interval doesn't go from 0 to 1 anymore. Now my interval goes from 0 to 2. And you might see number lines in your book today that look like this. So you're going to have a mark halfway between them. Now that wouldn't be 1/2, would it? Because 1/2 isn't halfway between 0 and 2. 1/2 would be somewhere else on the number line. So I'm going to put another line here and another interval there. This is where it's going to take a little bit of thinking, because somewhere between 0 and 2, there is a number on the number line, and it would be halfway between 0 and 2, but that's not the number 1/2. In this case, it's the number 1. 0, 1, 2, and then the number line would keep going 3, 4, 5, and so on. Now we can figure out that between 0 and 1, there's 2 intervals. Right? So the whole number 1, we'll call that in this case 2 halves. We know that's the same as the whole number 1. If that's 2 halves, then the one before it is 1/2. So we have 0 on the left, then we jump to 1/2, then we jump to 1, then we jump to, what is this interval between 1 and 2 on a number line? Hit pause in the video, think about that for a few seconds, and I'll give the answer in a moment. Okay, you had some time to think. We should realize by now that we jumped from 0 to 1/2, 1/2 to 1, 1 to, this would be 1 and 1/2. We're past the number 1 on the number line. We're not quite at 2, so we're at 1 and 1/2, and then we would jump to the whole number 2. I'm going to give you one final number line, and I want you to fill in the intervals. We'll start at 0 on the left. We'll go to 1, so we're just going to have the difference between 0 and 1. And let's put some intervals in here. Use the tips I just showed you. Try to figure out not how many lines you have, but how many interval jumps you have as you go through this. Hit pause again as soon as I'm done talking. Sketch out the number line on paper. See if you can figure out your answers, and hit resume, and I'll show you the answer in a moment. Okay, you guys have had some time to figure this out. I'm going to go into it now and explain it. So I'm going to start over here at 0 on the left. I'm going to make jumps. That's 1 jump, 2 jumps, 3 jumps, 4 jumps, 5, 6, 7, and 8 jumps. That means where I'm at over here at 1, we're going to say is the same as 8/8, and we know that is 1 whole. Well, if that's 8/8, that means this interval would be 7/8, 6/8, 5/8. You probably know what 1 is next. 1/2 or 4/8. We said 4/8 would be equal to 1/2. Then we go to 3/8, 2/8, and finally 1/8. So in this case, I have 8 intervals, and I'm splitting my lineup into what we'll call 8s. Keep this in mind because we're going to work through our workbooks and see a few more problems like this. See you guys in a bit.